Dear students and viewers, hello and welcome to this teleclass. My name is Altaf Hussain and I am working as a lecturer in the discipline of Environmental Science at Government Girls Higher Secondary School, Magam. Dear students, in this teleclass, we shall learn about the basic concept of ecological interactions, its importance, and the effect of the interactions between the members of different species in a biological community. Not only that, we shall be discussing about the different types of interactions which can occur or which can take place in an ecosystem or a biological community. Now, dear students, I want you to keep a notebook and a pen alongside you so that you can jot down important points, because this unit is going to be extremely important for your upcoming examinations, be it board examinations or competitive examinations like NEET. Now, before starting with the ecological interactions, I want to take you back to the concept of ecosystem. Now, what is an ecosystem? What is an ecosystem? Yes, an ecosystem is a self-regulating unit consisting of two things, the biotic and abiotic components, which interact with each other, resulting in the cyclic flow of materials and the unidirectional flow of energy. अब यहाँ पे मैंने बात की कि ecosystem एक self-regulating unit है. It is a self-regulating unit. Now, what do we mean by self-regulating unit? This means that a natural ecosystem, an ecosystem under natural conditions, operates or it functions. It operates or it functions without, now this is very important, without the external influence or interference. अब इसका क्या मतलब है without the external influence or interference? That means this ecosystem can sustain on its own. This ecosystem can ensure the cycling flow of materials. This ecosystem can ensure the flow of energy. Now, as I said in the definition, that it has got two components. Which one? The first one is biotic and the second one is abiotic, isn't it? Now, this biotic and this abiotic, they comprise the structure of the ecosystem, isn't it? So, they comprise the structure of the ecosystem. And what's included in this biotic component? These are different species interacting within the ecosystem. These are different species interacting within the ecosystem. And when we talk of the abiotic components, it comprises of the physical and the chemical components of the environment, and include air, water and land. Now, this comprises the structure of the ecosystem. Now, if we talk of the function of the ecosystem, if we talk of the function of the ecosystem. What do we mean by that? So we have a structure and we have a function. Structure में अभी मैंने लिखा we have biotic and abiotic components, and by function it includes the cycling of materials, and the flow of energy. Now, dear students, if there is no interaction between the biotic and abiotic components, if there is only a single species present in the ecosystem, would there be the cycling of materials? If there is a single species present in an ecosystem, will there be the flow of energy? And the answer is no. Hence, no single species can carry out either the cycling of materials, or no single species can carry out the flow of energy. So no single species can carry out the cycling of materials or the flow of energy. Therefore, इससे हमें क्या पता चलता है? There appears to be relationships. इससे हमें यह पता चलता है कि इकोसिस्टम के स्ट्रक्चर को मेंटेन रखने के लिए, इकोसिस्टम की फंक्शनिंग को कंटिन्यू रखने के लिए, एक इकोसिस्टम को सेल्फ रेगुलेटिंग बनाने के लिए देयर हैज टू बी रिलेशनशिप्स, देयर हैज टू बी इंटरैक्शंस. सो देयर अपीयर्स टू बी, तो इसमें बहुत सारी इंटरैक्शंस होती है विच टेक प्लेस बिटवीन द इंडिविजुअल ऑर्गेनिजम्स, जो ऑर्गेनिजम्स के बीच में होती है, और ये इंटरैक्शंस इनका इमीडिएट सराउंडिंग होता है, इनका जो इमीडिएट एनवायरनमेंट होता है उसके साथ भी इंटरैक्शंस होती है. सो वी कैन से देयर अपीयर्स टू बी वेरियस relationships there appears to be various relationships किनके बीच में? between the organisms and with the physical environment. सो इकोसिस्टम का स्ट्रक्चर मेंटेन रखने के लिए इंटरैक्शंस बिटवीन द बायोटिक एनवायरनमेंट एंड द एबायोटिक एनवायरनमेंट ये होना बहुत ही जरूरी है. और इकोसिस्टम फंक्शनिंग को मेंटेन रखने के लिए, इसको कंटिन्यू रखने के लिए, इसको एक सेल्फ रेगुलेटिंग यूनिट बनाने के लिए ये बहुत ही जरूरी है कि ये इंटरैक्शंस होती रहे बिटवीन द बायोटिक एंड द एबायोटिक कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ द एनवायरनमेंट. नाउ डियर स्टूडेंट्स, सिमिलरली, बिल्कुल इसी पैटर्न पे, similarly when we talk of the biological communities, जब भी हम biological communities की बात करते हैं, we say that the organisms in a biological community, कोई भी organism किसी भी biological community में isolation में नहीं रह सकता. So we can say in a biological community, no organism can live in कंप्लीट आइसोलेशन, बिल्कुल अकेले, विदाउट इंटरैक्टिंग। जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला कि कोई सिंगल स्पीशीज वो कैरी आउट नहीं कर सकती। क्या नहीं कर सकती? द फंक्शनिंग ऑफ इकोसिस्टम, द साइक्लिंग ऑफ मटेरियल्स। बिल्कुल उसी तरह किसी भी बायोलॉजिकल कम्युनिटी में ये जो ऑर्गेनिज्म है, इट कैनॉट रिमेन इन आइसोलेशन। सो इन अ बायोलॉजिकल कम्युनिटी नो ऑर्गेनिज्म कैन रिमेन इन कंप्लीट आइसोलेशन। इसका क्या मतलब है? दैट एन ऑर्गेनिज्म कैनॉट रिमेन इन कंप्लीट आइसोलेशन। इसका यह मतलब है दैट एन ऑर्गेनिज्म, कोई भी ऑर्गेनिज्म, एन ऑर्गेनिज्म इन ए बायोलॉजिकल कम्युनिटी इज इन्फ्लुएंस्ड, उस पर किसी ना किसी तरह का इन्फ्लुएंस होता है। और वो क्या इन्फ्लुएंस होंगे, वो क्या इफेक्ट्स होंगे, दैट वी विल स्टडी ड्यूरिंग द कोर्स ऑफ अवर लेक्चर, ड्यूरिंग ड्यू कोर्स ऑफ टाइम। सो इन एन कंप्लीट आइसोलेशन एन ऑर्गेनिज्म इन्फ्लुएंस्ड बाय द प्रेजेंस ऑफ अदर ऑर्गेनिजम्स, presence of other organisms. So the basic point is that ecosystem functioning, an ecosystem cannot function, an ecosystem cannot function unless and until there is interaction between the species. Species cannot survive, species cannot grow, species cannot protect themselves unless and until there is interaction between the two species, or unless and until there are interactions between the same species, that we will discuss in the due course of time. Now, since the species are influenced by the presence of other species, we can say that in an ecosystem the species are dependent on one another. So we can say that the species in an ecosystem, in a community, the species are dependent on, they are dependent on one another, isn't it? So the species are dependent on one another, and this interdependence of one species on the another is reflected in the form of interactions. And this interdependence, ये जो ये डिपेंडेंट होती है स्पीशीज, वन स्पीशीज डिपेंड होगी दूसरी स्पीशीज पे, ये मैनिफेस्ट होती है, ये रिफ्लेक्ट होती है इन द फॉर्म ऑफ वेरियस इंटरैक्शंस। और वो इंटरैक्शंस किस पे हो सकती है? दोज इंटरैक्शंस कैन बी फॉर फूड, जैसा कि मैंने अभी थोड़ी देर पहले आपको बोला। Those interactions can be for security, those interactions can be for reproduction, those interactions can be for growth, survival. So we can say this interdependence can be reflected, this interdependence can be reflected in the form of interactions, can be reflected in the form of interactions, and those interactions can be for food, those interactions can be for reproduction, those interactions can be for space, that is the habitat, or those interactions can be for protection, or we can say those interactions can be for growth. Those interactions can be for growth. So here we see जो ये species आपस में interact करती है, इनका जो इंटरैक्शंस का जो बेसिक मोटिव होता है दैट इज फूड. इंटरैक्शंस का पर्पस होता है रिप्रोडक्शन, एंड द पर्पस ऑफ दिस इंटरैक्शंस इज रिप्रोडक्शन, इट्स स्पेस, इट्स हैबिटेट, इट्स प्रोटेक्शन एंड इट्स ग्रोथ. नाउ दीज इंटरैक्शंस, जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला, these interactions, why are they important? These interactions they are important. These interactions are important because their survival depends on these interactions. So these interactions are important for their survival, for the survival of organisms, for the survival of organisms. और जब organisms survive करेंगे तो जाहिर सी बात है वो population ही, वो पूरी community ही survive करेगी. The community of organisms or the community as a group will survive when the individual organisms will survive. So we can say these interactions are important for the survival of organism and for the survival of community, and for the survival of community as a group, for the survival of community as a group. So we can say the survival is extremely important. Interactions का basic purpose जो है that is survival of organisms and the survival of community as a group, the survival of community as a group. Now all these interactions, all these relationships, all these interdependencies of the organisms among themselves, they are categorized as, they are defined as, they are referred to as ecological interactions. Now all these interactions, we can say all these relationships, or we can say all these activities, all these relationships or all these activities which are responsible for the survival of organisms and which affect the organisms either directly or indirectly are known as ecological interactions. Ecological interactions, or simply they are known as interactions. अब यहाँ पे आपको याद रखने की ज़रूरत है कि कोई भी ऐसी एक्टिविटी, कोई भी ऐसी रिलेशनशिप which is responsible for the growth of organisms, for reproduction, for security, for survival, for protection, all these interactions between the members of different species or between the members of the same species, all these relationships, all these activities, इनको हम क्या बोलते हैं? इन्हीं को हम basically बोलते हैं ecological interactions, or simply we call them interactions. Now जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला, अभी जब हमने लेक्चर स्टार्ट किया, जब मैंने टेली क्लास स्टार्ट किया तो मैंने इकोसिस्टम से स्टार्ट किया. तो बहुत सारे बच्चे कह रहे होंगे कि सर हमें तो इंटरैक्शंस पढ़ना है, सर ने इकोसिस्टम से क्यों स्टार्ट किया? तो यहाँ पर मैं आपको बताना बहुत ज़रूरी समझता हूँ कि इंटरैक्शंस आर नॉट ओनली फंडामेंटल, इंटरैक्शंस आर नॉट ओनली फंडामेंटल और extremely important to the survival of organisms. Interactions are not only fundamental or not only extremely important to the survival of organisms, but interactions are also important. जैसा कि हमने स्टार्ट में इसको डिस्कस किया, स्टार्ट में मैंने आपको बोला कि interactions are extremely important for the functioning of an ecosystem. Interactions are also important for the proper functioning of an ecosystem. Proper functioning of an ecosystem. Now, dear students, let's discuss about the different effects which an organism can have on his fellow organism, or the different types of effects which an organism can have on the other organisms. Now, these effects can be categorized into two broad categories, that is the direct effects and indirect effects. So we can write the effects. Now, what are these effects? These are the effects of one organism on the other organism. These effects can be categorized into two broad groups. The first one is the direct effect. The direct effect. And the second one is known as the indirect effect. The second one is known as the indirect effect. Indirect effect. The second one is known as the indirect effect. Now, as the name implies, here in the direct effect, it is, इससे क्या मतलब चलता है हमें डायरेक्ट इफेक्ट से, कि एक ऑर्गेनिज्म दूसरे ऑर्गेनिज्म को डायरेक्टली इंपैक्ट करता है, वो उसके साथ इंटरैक्ट करता है, एंड द इफेक्ट इज डायरेक्ट. डायरेक्ट से क्या मुराद है? डायरेक्ट से क्या मतलब है कि ये जो इफेक्ट होता है, इट इज नॉट मीडिएटेड और इट्स नॉट ट्रांसमिटेड थ्रू ए थर्ड ऑर्गेनिज्म. सो वी कैन से it is the direct effect. It is the direct effect of one organism on the other. और इसमें क्या होता है? डायरेक्ट इंपैक्ट. देयर इज नॉट द इन्वॉल्वमेंट ऑफ एनी मीडिएशन. इसमें कोई मीडिएशन नहीं होती है, इसमें कोई थर्ड ऑर्गेनिज्म इन्वॉल्व नहीं होता है. तो इसलिए हम इसको क्या बोलते हैं? इसलिए हम इसको डायरेक्ट इंपैक्ट बोलते हैं. तो इसकी जो एग्जाम्पल है डायरेक्ट इफेक्ट की, जैसा कि मैंने इसमें बोला आपको कि इसमें थर्ड ऑर्गेनिज्म इन्वॉल्व नहीं होता है. नो थर्ड organism is involved. तभी तो हम इसको डायरेक्ट इफेक्ट बोलेंगे. नाउ इसकी जो एग्जांपल्स है, वी कैन टेक द एग्जांपल ऑफ द पॉलिनेशन ऑफ बर्ड. द pollination by bees or birds, isn't it? The pollination of flowers by bees. The pollination of flowers, isn't it? Similarly, we have one more example, that is the prey-predator relationship. Prey-predator relationship. Now, this prey-predator relationship we will discuss as we get along this lecture. ठीक है? So these are the two direct impacts. These are the two direct effects one individual can have on the other individual. इसमें और एक example है, we can write down. We can have host-parasite relationship. Host-parasite relationship. We can have so many examples, but you can remember these three. That is the pollination. That is another one is the prey-predator relationship. And the third one, it is the host-parasite relationship. So what is direct effect now? Direct effect is the direct effect, as the name implies, of one organism on the other organism without the involvement of a third organism, without the involvement of any sort of mediation, or without the involvement of any transmitter species. सो उसमें हम बोलते हैं, उस केस में हम बोलते हैं दैट द इफेक्ट इज डायरेक्ट. नाउ लेट्स टॉक अबाउट द इनडायरेक्ट इफेक्ट. What is indirect effect now? Now here in this case the observed effect, जो effect concerned species पे पड़ेगा, here the observed effect, अब ये जो observed effect है on the concerned species, the observed effect of the, उसको हम बोलते हैं the species which influences, that is known as the donor species. The observed effect of donor species is transmitted. The observed effect of the donor species, the observed donor species is transmitted through an intermediate species. और ये इफेक्ट किसको पहुंचता है? रेसिपिएंट को. सो अगर हम इसको ऐसे रिप्रेजेंट करें, वी हैव थ्री स्पीशीज. Suppose we have three species. Species A, we have species B, and we have species C. Suppose we have three species. Now this is the species which will cast an impact on species C, right? Now this will affect that this species, and this species will have an impact on the third species, right? So this is how, this is the recipient species. This is the recipient species, and this one which transmits the impact, which transmits the effect, it's known as, this species is known as the transmitter. It's known as transmitter. And the first one which causes the impact, it's known as the donor species. Now take for example, let's take the example of predator bird. Now this predator bird, what it does, it aggressively preys on specific caterpillars. It aggressively preys on the caterpillars. So in that case it reflects the predator prey relationship. So this is the predator and this is the prey. ये इसको खा जाता है, इसको किल करता है, और उससे क्या हो जाता है, इसकी पॉपुलेशन कम हो जाती है. It aggressively preys on these specific caterpillars. Now इससे क्या होगा, there will be a reduction in herbivory. तो यहां पे हमारी बेसल स्पीशीज है, वो एक प्लांट है. यहां पे एक बेसल स्पीशीज है विच इज अ प्लांट. तो इससे क्या होगा, जब यहां पे एग्रेसिवली ये प्रे करेगा, इसको प्रेडेटर इसको डिवोर करेगा, इसका पॉपुलेशन साइज कम होगा. नाउ व्हाट विल हैपन, देयर विल बी ए रिडक्शन इन herbivory. There will be a reduction in herbivory. और उससे क्या होगा, the population size of this basal plant species, it will increase. So it will increase. Though the predator bird, it has a direct impact on the specific caterpillars, but it indirectly affects the basal plant species by increasing their number. Now the question is, I have written a word here, herbivory. Now what is this herbivory? You should always remember that whenever the primary consumer is a herbivore. Obviously it is a herbivore. You should always remember, whenever the predator is in the form of a primary consumer, that is the herbivore, right? So, and the prey is a plant, such a phenomenon is known as herbivory. Now ये herbivory अब क्या होता है? Herbivory is a special form of predation जहां पे predator एक primary consumer है और prey क्या है? Prey is a plant, and such a phenomenon is known as herbivory, Herbivory, herbivory. So this is how the predator bird has an indirect effect on the plants by removing its specific caterpillars, right? So this is an impact of predator bird on the basal plant species. Now let's quickly revise, what do we mean by the direct effect? Direct effect means, as the word implies, it is the direct effect of one organism on the other without the involvement of a third organism, without the involvement of a third species. Examples: pollination. Examples: we have prey predator relationships. Examples: we have host parasite relationships. Now on the other hand, on the contrary, if we talk of the indirect species, if we talk of the indirect effect, so what do we mean by the indirect effect? Indirect effect में donor species impact करती है recipient species को with the help of a transmitter. It does not have an impact directly on the recipient species, but it transmits its effect through a transmitter. And the best example is that of a predator bird, which has an impact on the basal species, which is the plant in this case, and it transmits the effect through specific caterpillars. Now we can say that the indirect effect consists of, अगर हम यहाँ पे फिर से देखें, so indirect effect is basically a sequence of two direct effect steps. So it causes a direct effect on species B, and species B causes a direct effect on species A. So we can say indirect effect, consists of, a sequence of two direct effect steps. जैसा कि आप इसमें देख सकते हैं, species A impacts the species C, but through species B, but through a transmitter. So you can see it is the direct effect of A and B. This is the first direct effect, and this is the second direct effect. So we can say that indirect effect is a sequence of two direct effect steps. This is very important, you should remember this. Now let's discuss about the types of interactions. Types of interactions. Now, what are the different types of interactions? This is an extremely important question from the viewpoint of your board examinations and from the viewpoint of your NEET examinations as well. Especially मैं medical students की बात कर रहा हूँ. Very important question. Now, what are the different types of interactions? नाउ इन इकोलॉजी, जब हम इकोलॉजी पढ़ते हैं, इन इकोलॉजी interactions can take place between the members of same species, or the interactions can take place between the members of different species. Now here we have two cases. First one, the interaction can take place between the members of same species, or the interactions can take place between the members of different species. The second case is interactions between the members of different species. I repeat, there can be two types of interactions. The first interaction is between the members of same species, or the second type of interaction can be the interaction between the members of different species. Now, for example, if the interaction takes place, suppose we have species A and we have one more species A, they are the same species, and if the interactions takes place between them, right, they interact with each other. Now what do they interact with for? They interact for growth, they interact for reproduction, that I will tell you. So this interaction is known as intraspecific interaction. Intraspecific interaction. So when the interaction takes place between the members of same species, such an interaction is known as intraspecific interaction. Now what does this interaction take place for? ये किस लिए इंटरेक्शन होती है? ये दो स्पीशीज आपस में क्यों इंटरेक्ट करते हैं? Now this interaction can take place. It can take place for reproduction. This interaction can take place for reproduction. This is one of the types of interactions जिसको हम mating भी बोलते हैं, क्योंकि स्पीशीज जब हम डिफाइन करते हैं, स्पीशीज का एक मेन कैरेक्टरिस्टिक फीचर ये है दैट द स्पीशीज शुड इंटरब्रीड among themselves. Species should interbreed, they should be able to produce their like, they should be able to reproduce. So the intraspecific interaction में सबसे जो पहली interaction है, that is mating or reproduction. They can interact in one more way, that is they show a lot of parental care for the members of the same species. There is parental care. There is parental care. Not only that, they show the leadership. Leadership is also an interaction. They have one more interaction pattern that's known as altruism. Altruism. We have to discuss all these interactions one by one. Is altruism. There is one more characteristic feature of group formation. I will write it here. Group formation. Group formation. Where they form the families. Where they form the families. And there is group aggregation. There is group aggregation. Not only that, they show the territorial behavior. They show the territorial behavior. Territorial behavior. Now all these interactions, whether it's territorial behavior, whether it's reproduction, parental care, leadership, altruism, group formation, family formation. Now all these, whether it's dominance is one more. Now all these interactions, they are a part of intraspecific interactions. This is how intraspecific interaction is manifested between the members of the same species. Now on the other hand, we have interactions that can take place between the members of different species. We have interactions that can take place between the members of different species, and those interactions are known as interspecific interactions. Interspecific interactions. Interspecific interactions. Now what are interspecific interactions? Interspecific interactions वो interactions होती है जहां पे दो different species involved होती है, जहां पे दो different species involved होती है. For example, we have species A and we have species B. We have species A, species B. They are two different species. ये दो अलग अलग species है, और जो ये आपस में interact करेंगे, कोई भी interaction इनमें आपस में हो, now these interactions are known as interspecific interactions. Interspecific interactions. Now these interspecific interactions, now depending on the duration ड्यूरेशन के बेसिस पे, यानी ये कब तक इंटरैक्ट करेंगे, ये these interactions, they can be short lived or they can be long lived. They can be short lived or they can be lifelong. We'll discuss about these interactions. They can be short lived or they can be long lived. Not only that, depending on the direction of the interactions, these interactions can be direct, जैसा कि हमने थोड़ी देर पहले डिस्कस किया. They can be direct or they can be indirect. They can be direct or they can be indirect. Now let's classify these ecological interactions, or let's see what are the different types of interactions as a whole. We'll draw a flow chart on the board. उससे आपको और भी क्लियर हो जाएगा कि different types of interactions कौन होती है between the members of same species or different species. We may write over here ecological interactions. Ecological interactions. Now, जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला, yes, on the basis of the species, whether the species are same or different. What are the two types of species? Yes, exactly, it is interspecific and intraspecific. It is interspecific and intraspecific. So I'll write first one, the interspecific. The second one is the intraspecific. Now what is interspecific? I want to repeat. Interspecific is the interaction between the members of different species. Here we write the different species. Interactions between the different species. And what do we mean by intraspecific? That is the interactions among the members of the same species. Now we categorize interspecific interactions into two more subtypes. The first one is positive interactions. Positive interactions. And negative interactions. and negative interactions. We have one more interaction that is known as neutralism. That's neither positive nor negative. We will come to that a little later. So that's known as neutralism. Now we classify intraspecific interactions into two subgroups. First one is the cooperative. And the second one is competitive. Now what are the different types of positive interactions? Now positive interactions can be first one, mutualism. The second type of positive interactions is proto-cooperation. We have one more type of positive interaction. It's known as commensalism. And dear students, आपके सिलेबस में और एक रिलेशनशिप जो लिखी हुई है, that is scavenging. Although whatever interactions we discussed in this class, we discussed the interactions between the members of same or different species, but those were the living species. Now there is one more interaction जिसको मैं यहाँ पे अलग से लिखूंगा, that is known as scavenging. अब मैंने यहाँ पे scavenging को अलग क्यों लिखा, ये हम बाद में डिस्कस करेंगे. So in positive interactions we have mutualism, we have proto-cooperation, we have commensalism, and last we have scavenging. Now similarly, the negative interactions can be further classified into different groups. The first one is competition. The second type of negative interaction which can take place between the members of different species is that's known as predation. The third type of negative interaction that's known as amensalism. And last but not the least, we have one more negative interaction that is known as parasitism. So these are the different types of positive interactions on the left side here, wherein we have mutualism, wherein we study proto-cooperation, wherein we study commensalism and scavenging. That we will discuss a little later. That's why I have kept it aside. So negative interactions में हमारी जो पहली interaction है, that is competition. We have predation, amensalism, and we have parasitism. अब आप बोलेंगे सर यहाँ पर भी competition है, तो intraspecific में भी competition है, तो interspecific में भी competition है. Yes, we can have competition between the members of same species as well as the members of the different species. So in this case we can say the competition can be intraspecific as well as interspecific. That we will discuss inshallah during the course of our lecture. Now let's discuss about the positive interactions. Let's take up the positive interactions first. Now, what are positive interactions? What are positive interactions? Positive interactions. What are positive interactions? Positive interactions. Now, as the name indicates, positive, that means the organisms derive some sort of a benefit out of these interactions. So, we can say positive interactions are those relationships, positive interactions are those interactions in which both the species, they get benefited, or at least one of the participating species gets benefited while the other one is unaffected. So, we can say positive interactions are those interrelationships or those interactions in which either both the participating species get benefited, or at least one of the species gets benefited, while as the other one remains unaffected. The other one remains unaffected. Now, what do we mean by that, remains unaffected? We mean that either we will have a plus-plus relationship in which both the species will get benefit, or we will have a +0 relationship in which only one species will get benefited while the other will remain unaffected, or unharmed. Now, this positive interactions, what's their significance, what's their importance? Now, they promote coexistence among the species. Now, positive interactions, what do? They promote what? Coexistence. They promote coexistence among the species, especially in harsh environmental conditions, especially in harsh physical and biological conditions, or the physical and biological stresses. So, they promote coexistence in physical and biological stresses. Now, dear students, before proceeding further, I want to take a quick recap of the entire lecture which we have studied so far, which we have discussed so far. We were discussing the ecological interactions. We discussed the ecological interactions. What are the interactions? Interactions are nothing but the interrelationships, but the activities of various organisms of different communities. तो उसकी वजह से क्या होता है, उनमें कैपेसिटी आ जाती है सर्वाइवल की, इकोसिस्टम में हार्श एनवायरमेंटल कंडीशंस में सर्वाइव करने की. दे ग्रो, दे रिप्रोड्यूस, दे प्रोटेक्ट देमसेल्व्स. सो दिस इज द सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ इंटरैक्शंस. उसके बाद हमने बोला कि एक ऑर्गेनिज्म जो है ये इफेक्ट कर सकता है दूसरे ऑर्गेनिज्म को बाय 2 ways. What are those 2 ways? Yes, they can be direct impact or an indirect impact. डायरेक्ट इम्पैक्ट में हमने बोला एक ऑर्गेनिज्म डायरेक्टली इफेक्ट करता है विदाउट द इन्वॉल्वमेंट ऑफ ए थर्ड ऑर्गेनिज्म. यहाँ पे कोई इंटरमीडिएट स्पीशीज नहीं होती है. फिर मैंने एग्जांपल दी आपको पॉलिनेशन ऑफ बर्ड्स, प्रेडेशन, होस्ट पैरासाइट रिलेशनशिप्स. सिमिलरली इन द इनडायरेक्ट इफेक्ट्स, इनडायरेक्ट इफेक्ट में हमने क्या देखा? इनडायरेक्ट इफेक्ट में हमने ये देखा कि डोनर स्पीशीज जो होती है दैट इम्पैक्ट्स the recipient species through the involvement of an intermediate species. तो फिर मैंने एग्जांपल आपको दी प्रेडेटर बर्ड की, हाउ इट इन्फ्लुएंसेस द बेसल प्लांट स्पीशीज थ्रू द इन्वॉल्वमेंट ऑफ स्पेसिफिक कैटरपिलर्स। उसके बाद हमने इंटरेक्शंस को डिस्कस किया, व्हाट आर द डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ इंटरेक्शंस, what are interspecific interactions, that is the interactions between the members of different species, what are intraspecific, that is the intraspecific are the interactions between the members of same species. So further we classified interspecific into two categories, the positive interactions and the negative interactions. We further classified positive into four groups. We have mutualism, we have mutualism, we have proto-cooperation, we have commensalism, and the last which we discussed, that is scavenging. And negative interactions में हमने क्या बोला आपको, negative interactions में भी classes है. We have parasitism, we have competition, we have amensalism, isn't it? So these are the different types of interactions which we will be discussing in the coming lectures. Similarly, we have intraspecific. We categorize intraspecific into two categories, that is the cooperative and the competitive. So my dear students, this was all for today's lecture. We'll be meeting again in the another teleclass with yet another topic. Until then, take care, stay home and stay safe.